Hey everyone, welcome back to a new session in our journey through the Hebrew Bible, through Biblical Hebrew. By now, we've probably noticed a bit of a trend in the topics we're dealing with, that especially in the last few weeks, it feels like the new material we're getting at is building on older material. So I hope that's a helpful thing to kind of push us back into content that's perhaps still settling in as we kind of move towards the end of the term. And today's really no exception. We're going to look at something called the construct state. And what we'll see is this is built on a number of things related to the noun system and the adjective system. Two things that on their own are related, and here we'll see them kind of relate in a new way. The topic we're looking at today will sound a lot like things, if you've taken, for example, New Testament Greek, Koine Greek, this will sound a lot like the genitive case there. In Hebrew, we've got this construct relationship. So we're going to look at that today. We'll look at the background of it a little bit in the nouns and adjective systems, drawing on some of those insights here. Applying some of those old ideas into this new grammatical item, and think a little bit about the syntax of this state in a sentence. Now, having said that, I got to admit there's a fair bit of information in this chapter. This is one of the larger ones because of a number of kind of tables and lists, but don't let that scare you. I'm hoping we can have a concise kind of run through the most important things here in the podcast. And then when we're together, spend a bit of time doing some review, maybe messing around, playing a few games if we can, to try to get a sense of what else we want to know about in that chapter. So that's my sales pitch for the construct state. Now let's get started. So here we are with a simple example of a Hebrew construct state. Well, what is that? What are we talking about? Our definition for that is right here. What we're talking about is a relationship between two nouns that indicates some sort of possessive relationship, typically possessive relationship between the two of them. Now, in translation, we've seen this a number of times in Hebrew, where to make sense of something in translation, we have to have a helping word. So far, we've seen this a number of times where we need a verb, so we throw is or are in there. Here we're not talking about a verb, but we're talking about this letter or this word here. The word of is what we're going to be using to make sense of this in English. We'll unpack each item of the construct state in a moment, but already if we were to try to translate this form up at the top of the page, devar, we would all probably be able to identify that by now as the word for word. There's a few changes here that we'll talk about in a few minutes, but davar is our word here. It says devar. Word, and then Elohim is God. Now, I would hope that we can kind of start to see that if we were to say word God, that doesn't make any sense. We need that helping word already, even if we do a rough translation. In English, we would say word of God, and insert that helping word there. The construct state, let's make that our default position. That we're going to have that helping word to signal that relationship, and it will come between those two nouns. In this case, we would say the word of God or a word of God, something like that. That's what's going on at the very front end of this chapter. That's the basics of what this is. We're going to look at some of the middle parts of the chapter, but before we do, I thought I'd just fast forward to the very end of it, pages 104 and 105. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, at least in the podcast, but we've said that this meaning here will be our most common meaning, possession, where we'll say we'll use that word of. What Ross also gives us is a number of other possible syntactical uses of the genitive. Things like it could indicate source or authorship. It could indicate subjective or objective genitives, attributives, or material. What we're getting at there is kind of splitting hairs of the different nuances we can find in how the construct is applied. For my money, this is where things start to get interesting. We're just touching on it right now, but we're already at a point in Hebrew, in our first year Hebrew, where we're starting to get at a level below translation into how language and structure of sentences, how syntax gives us very, very fine nuances of meaning. That's where second year Hebrew really gets interesting. We'll do a little bit of this next semester when we're diving into a full book. We're going to look at the book of Jonah, and we'll be looking at all sorts of things under the hood, translating, but looking at things like genitive states and how can we find closer and more measured nuances. So that's kind of what's ahead, but for now, why don't we stick with this translation here of, and we'll get used to putting that in this position between our two nouns when they're in a construct state. So that's what it is. That's some of the ways it will use it to fine-tune our translation. Let's get a little bit deeper to go from our definition to now looking at the different forms that we find in this relationship and how they're identified and how they relate to each other. All right, so here we've got another familiar set of words: Sus, Hamelech, horse, the king. Already with that kind of basic wooden translation, we can see something's missing. So this is going to be our example we'll use to unpack the two parts of this equation in a construct state. When we encounter a pair of words, two or more I should say, in a construct relationship, what we're dealing with is one noun that's said to be the construct noun and another noun that is said to be the absolute noun. So this will be our construct noun. This will be our absolute noun. Now let's walk through these individually and see what we can say about them and figure out how they work and how to translate them. So let's start on the Sus side of the equation, on the construct side. The construct noun is the governing word in the arrangement. So what that means is it will modify what follows. So Sus in this situation will modify Hamelech. Sus is the construct noun, so it modifies what follows. Now there can be multiple construct nouns, which I'm sure sounds fun. So what we may have is what we'll call a construct chain. So the idea is you could have Sus, but you could also have another set of constructs before it. You can have multiple construct nouns, but they will always be first in this arrangement. Those construct nouns could also take things like inseparable prepositions, like any nouns, that's fine. And what we will see in a minute, and then more closely in the textbook in Ross's descriptions, is that when nouns are put into a construct state, that is Sus, or in our previous example, Devar, we can expect to see some changes happen in the way that they're vocalized, as well as some inflectional changes to their endings. So this point here is one I want us to kind of highlight and come back to. And what we're talking about here is that chart on the top of page 101 in Ross, if you're following along, and the next page where he gives a summary of construct formations and describes those changes. Those are some of the things to know about construct nouns: their position, what they do in this arrangement, and a few things to kind of go back to in the textbook, specifically on that last point. But before we look at that, anything else in here, why don't we look at the other side of this equation with absolute nouns? Now, because this is a construct state or a construct chain, we need to have an absolute noun. What is that? What does it mean? You remember that lexical form that we all know and love, as well as that noun paradigm that's ingrained in our minds about singular and plural and dual nouns. The absolute noun will always, always, always be the second or the last noun in a chain. And it will always, always, always be a common lexical form, like we know, or inflected along the common patterns that we already know from the noun paradigm. So here's one of those places where if you know that noun paradigm, you're going to be able to identify your absolute nouns right away. It shouldn't be a problem. One thing to keep in mind, however, is while there could be multiple construct nouns like Sus, and we could have other ones before it, there will only ever be one absolute noun. That is something we can bank on. That despite the possibility of this being a chain, what we'll see is the chain links, if you will be construct nouns, whereas the absolute noun will only be one. So let's come back to this example then. Sus Hamelech. If we had to translate this, we would say the king's horse, or the horse of the king. That's what we would have to do to translate there. We need our helping word of, and we would pop that right in the middle. But for now, we can start to unpack these forms and these phrases in this state to understand how the two relate to each other and how we go about translating them. So that's what we'll look at in the next few slides, is starting to think more about syntax and translation and follow up on some of this conversation when we're back together in class. Now, one of the things that would be worth reminding ourselves of when we start thinking about syntax and translation is how definite status and definite articles are really important to pay attention to for guiding how to translate our construct states. Now, one of the tricks of the trade is remembering the construct noun will not take the definite article. So what we're seeing in both of our examples down here that we'll unpack in more detail in a moment, our construct nouns here are both sus. There is no definite article on either of them. The construct noun will not take a definite article. Now remember, so far in Hebrew we've had a number of ways, I guess a growing list of ways that a Hebrew noun can be made definite. So the first one we saw was a proper name or a place name. Those are by default definite. Then we have our definite articles. So our article down here that we see, ha melech, that ha is a way of making something definite. We'll get to shortly pronominal suffixes that can make something definite, as well as demonstrative pronouns and adjectives that can make something definite. So that's kind of our list, but the thing for us here today is that by virtue of its association with the absolute noun, the construct noun inherits the definite status of the absolute noun. Since there can only be one absolute noun, this also means that the definite status of the absolute extends to all of the construct nouns if there are more than one. So let's look at a few examples. So to review, we said sus in both these examples is our construct noun, always comes first and can never take the article. In our first example, we have simply melech, a king. There's nothing to indicate this is a definite king. There's no pronominal suffix. There's no definite article. So in this example, we would probably translate that something as a horse of a king. The whole thing is indefinite. We don't have an article in this position. This is indefinite, so the absolute noun is indefinite. Therefore, the construct noun inherits that indefinite status. A horse of a king would probably be our most natural option. That's an example of an indefinite noun. Well, let's look down below. Here again, we said we've got our construct noun. We know it can never take the definite article, so how do we determine its definite status? Well, we have to look to the absolute noun. In this case, ha-melech, with our items there, the ha and the patach and the dagesh, indicating that we have a definite article here, the king. What that means then is that the sus inherits that definite status. So this would be most naturally the horse of the king, or potentially could be the king's horse, a horse of the king, all depending on context. But for the point to take away here is that you may have some ambiguity in context of whether or not the sus is in fact definite or indefinite, but if it is meant to be definite, it will inherit that definite status from this definite article right here. That's what we're getting into, and we'll probably start to see this more often, as I hate to always kind of come back to this, well, it's the context, but in many cases it is. What we're learning here are some grammatical rules, kind of like music theory, and then when you put those into practice, the theory still applies, but it's adapted to the nuances at times of the narrative, the sentence, the phrase you're in. So what we're getting at here is the guidelines, but we'll have to kind of pay attention to where we need to flex these things as we move ahead into translation. All right, so why don't we look at a few of these phrases in a limited context and try to work on some translations now. The one item that I felt would be worth looking at from this chapter in a bit more detail would be how construct chains behave when there's an attributive adjective involved. We dealt with adjectives a few weeks ago, and these were those words that describe a quality or characteristic about another noun. We had attributive adjectives. We also had predicate adjectives and substantive. Here we're talking about those attributive ones. So that grammar behind that world of adjectives is really important to know. It pays off in 2 or 3 or 4 different ways in kind of first-year Hebrew. Here's just one of them. So what do we want to know about these? The first thing on our list up top is that attributive adjectives will always, always, always follow the entire construct chain. We're going to look at these examples below in a moment in translation, but let's just do this. What we are seeing on both of these examples is here's our construct noun, There's our absolute, there's our construct noun, there's our absolute. The adjective in both cases is a form of tov, meaning good, and it shows up at the end afterwards, after the entire chain. One thing that would be really helpful to kind of keep in mind is that a rule of thumb is that absolutely nothing can intervene between that construct and absolute noun. Therefore, if the adjective modifies either one of those items in the chain, it's got to come at the very tail end of that chain. So that's what's going on in that first point above, is just making it really clear that nothing can come between what's going on in that construct chain. So keep the construct and absolute nouns together, and don't worry about trying to put something in between there, because nothing will show up in between them. So that's our first point up here, is that nothing can come in between these items in the sentence. The second one is our also important 3-agree rule. Our attributive adjectives, when they are put in a context of a construct chain, they must agree with whatever noun they modify in gender, in number, and indefinite status. To kind of look at our examples below in a minute again, these are both our adjectives, we said. Now, if we want to figure out which item or which noun they modify, either the construct or the absolute, they have to agree with those items. And we have to be able to parse them to understand why they agree with those items. This is where the adjectives are important, as also where our nouns are really important. If you don't have a handle on how to parse nouns, you're still unfamiliar with those endings and how they're inflected for person, for rather gender and number, then go back and review that, because that's going to add value here in the way that you can understand and translate your Hebrew sentences. So why don't we look at these two examples, and then we'll call it a day. At face value, they look very similar. There's only one or two things that are different here, but the things that are different give us clues on how to translate the sentence properly. So here we're dealing with a limited context. We've been saying look at the context. Well, let's take a look at some examples where that's actually helpful. The first example that we have, devar, this one here, devar hamalcha hatov. Devar hamalcha hatov. Now, to translate this, we want to pay attention to how we parse these nouns. So our construct noun, devar, if we were to parse that, we would call that a masculine singular. Hamalcha, that ending there is telling us this is a feminine noun. In this case, it's the queen. Hatov is our adjective meaning the good. And if we were to go back and look at our paradigm, we would see that that's a masculine singular adjective. So in this little phrase, this little example, this adjective, hatov, agrees with devar. Yeah, they're both masculine, they're both singular, and they are in fact both definite. Why? Because the construct noun inherits the definite status from the absolute noun. Here then we would translate that as the word of the good, the good word of the queen. The good word of the queen. So we're looking for agreement there, and that has to do with parsing all those items and seeing how they match up. The really kind of difficult part might be just kind of wrapping our head around this item here, where that definite status of our construct noun, in fact, you have to look to the absolute noun, hamalcha, to know that devar is in fact inheriting that definite status. So there's a lot going on in there, but that's one example of where context can be helpful in determining differences. Let's look down at the very bottom one before we're done. Devar hamalcha hatova. Slightly different. What we're seeing here is devar is the same, hamalcha is the same. However, what's different in this example is this ending here. And that ending, as we know from our adjectives, indicates a feminine singular adjective, hatova. So if we want to do the same thing and ask where these things agree, we would say again, devar is a masculine singular noun. Hamalcha is a feminine singular noun, and it's definite. So if we match all of those things up, we would see that hatova is in full agreement in number, definite status, and gender with Hamalcha. So here we would translate that as the word of the good queen. The word of the good queen. In this case, the adjective modifies that absolute noun. So those are some slight differences there, but make things that make a big impact on the way we would translate that phrase and the meaning of that phrase in a Hebrew sentence. So at times we've been splitting hairs, and there's a lot of little details going on here, but there's a good example of where paying attention to those old rules and applying them in a new way is actually very helpful for now determining how to translate a full phrase that impacts the meaning of or could impact the meaning of a sentence in a very important way. So that's, in my mind, the most important things going on in this chapter. There's a lot of other things like translation, as we said, and like changes to construct nouns and vowel patterns. I didn't feel like that was the thing to kind of drill here in the podcast. Right, I really wanted to focus on was the function and the meaning of this, and then we can look at forms perhaps a bit more when we're together.